Greetings, friends, and welcome to part 2 of chapter 12 of the reading of the Grand Design Exposed, the Perpetrators and Evolution of the Great French Revolution. And obviously in the previous pages, we're basically getting a rundown of all the individuals, certain names, and oh boy, I have to apologize. My French is nowhere near that great, because there's a lot of French names within the last section. And this is a pretty hard chapter to read, so there's a lot of very Frenchy type words, okay, that and names and stuff like that. So I apologize if I butcher some of these names. I do the best I can. But this is probably one of the hardest chapters to read, as far as that goes. So, but basically, we have got introduced to a Cardinal de Rohan and a Cagliostro, which was a magician, and and we're seeing how all of these groups of Freemasonry and these types of things are being used to set the stages in order to ignite what will eventually turn into the French Revolution. And so this is basically the setting the stage here. The previous pages we just read. We got introduced to Queen Mary Antoinette. We're going to see what happens to her before too long. So I just want to back up and read the previous paragraph for continuity, and then we will pick up in the next section. Of all the prestigious names listed as being actively involved in occultic Freemasonry, and the goal it was rushing its members toward, only through censoring history does the general public lose sight of the true conspirators. And if you have been following along in this book, you should already know who the true conspirators are that are behind the scenes pulling the strings within Freemasonry. And that's the Jesuit order. Certainly these things were not done in a closet. Cagliostro confidently estimated the followers of his own right to amount to 1 million members. But better than that, France had 26 Masonic lodges that were presided over by Catholic priests, and members of the clergy of all ranks constantly frequented Masonic rituals. Folks, all roads will always lead back to Rome. You got Masonic, look to Rome, because you're going to see the footprints of Rome all over Freemasonry. You're going to see the footprints of Rome all over the Illuminati. You're going to see the footprints of Rome all over the Zionists, the so-called Jews that rule the world, the Rothschilds and these types of things, when all you have to do is, do a little research, and you'll come to find out that the Rothschilds are the guardians of the Vatican treasury. And I always make this analogy, okay? If you go to a bank and you put money into the bank, now I'm talking old school here, okay? Not the corrupt banking system that is now, but realistically, you go to a bank, you put money into the bank. It's your money, right? You make a deposit, you make a savings account, a checking account, and you put money into the bank. Well, who is guarding that money? Well, it's the employers that work at that bank. That's who's guarding it. Okay? But it's still your money. The same logic applies to the Vatican treasury. Okay? The Vatican treasury uses the Rothschild banking system. It's still the Vatican's money. It's not the Rothschilds' money. They are guarding the Vatican treasury. Okay? So, just because they're guarding something doesn't mean that they're the ones ruling everything. Catholic lodges had been founded in Paris under the protection of the Marquis, here we go again, Marquis de Girardin and Dubois, both royalists and friends of Saint Germain, whose goal was to, quote, establish communication between God and man by means of intermediary beings, unquote. Soon so many priests were attending the Egyptian ceremonies as Roman Catholic priests, declaring themselves highly satisfied with the rite, that Cagliostro, whose dream was to effect a union of his Egyptian science of magic with the fundamental beliefs of Catholic Christianity, was moved to hope his order might at last be recognized by the Pope, as had been the order of the Knights of St. John. Cardinal de Rohan promised Cagliostro his support and appealed to the Archbishop of Bordeaux, of Bourges, to whom Cagliostro explained his right. This resulted in a favorable report being sent to Rome. But an unexpected Parisian scandal was to pit the Pope's dutiful acolyte Louis XVI against the forces of Freemasonry and accelerate the French Revolution. And here we pick up in this next section Cagliostro, Cardinal de Rohan, and the diamond necklace scandal. This scandal is what basically was used to launch what would inevitably become the French Revolution. With two strikes against her, the court of Louis XVI was hostile to Queen Marie Antoinette. First, because she was an Austrian, not French, and second, because of her extravagant spending sprees in times when France was considered to be in a financial crisis. The Queen, attached to an impotent husband, cheated of romance, amused herself with costly dresses, gems, and palaces, with operas, plays, and balls. Her longing for jewelry became almost a mania. She lost fortunes in gambling and gave fortunes to favorites in reckless generosity. The king, always willing to please his queen, indulged her because he admired and loved her, and because he was grateful for her patience with his impotence. Giving birth to a second son, March 25th of 1785, the king was so pleased he bought and gave her the Palace of St. Cloud. The court condemned this indifferent extravagance, and the public never forgot her intemperate expenditure of its taxes, nicknaming the Queen Madame Deficit, or Madame Deficit. The stage was set. So basically, the Queen would use taxpayer money in order to indulge herself. And as a result of that, when the taxpayers' money basically became not enough, then more taxes were added on to the public, just so she could continue in her lust for materialism. And hence, this was the stage that was set. Back to the book. Then there was a string of 647 diamonds, allegedly weighing 2,800 carats. The two court jewelers, Charles Bonheur and Paul Bessange, who had bought diamonds from half the world to make a necklace for Madame du Barry, were confident that Louis XV would buy for her. But Louis XV died. Who now would buy so fabulously expensive an adornment? The jewelers offered it to Queen Marie Antoinette, who wanted it, but the king, considering the economic condition of the country, refused to buy it for her, or so the story goes, as confessed by an enterprising lady of the court. Jeanne de Saint Ram de Valois, who called herself Countess de la Motte, was an attractive and ingenious lady with an extraordinarily vivacious personality. Flitting and fluttering around Paris and Versailles, she charmed with her radiance and soon became mistress to Cardinal de Rohan. Pretending to have high intimacy at the court, she offered to win the Queen's approval of the Cardinal's aims to become chief minister, convincing him that she had access to the Queen, whose favors she could obtain, if only, with his large fortune, he would guarantee a financial transaction. Telling him of the Queen's great desire for the diamond necklace and her terrible disappointment in not being able to have it, but could, if the Cardinal would merely act as guarantor to the bankers who owned the necklace. Then the Queen could acquire it immediately and pay for it in installments from her own private funds. In return, she would grant the Cardinal her favor, quote unquote, and even meet him clandestinely in the park of Versailles. The Cardinal, swept away by this lady's sexual attractions, was even more delighted and infatuated by the prospect of becoming a lover of the reputedly sensuous Queen, fell completely for the scheme. De la Motte worked hard, having had forged letters from the Queen authorizing the Cardinal to buy the necklace in her name, even disguised a prostitute to meet the Cardinal in the park impersonating the Queen. When the Cardinal presented the letters, and these were forged letters, Rome's definitely no stranger to forgeries, now are they? When the Cardinal presented the letters of the Queen promising to pay in installments with his written guarantee to the bankers, the gems were surrendered to him. Rohan took the necklace at de la Motte's request and turned them over to an alleged representative of the Queen. That was last seen of the diamonds. It did not take long when the first installment came due and the Queen did not pay up, for certain people to realize that they had been had. The bankers going to the Queen, the shocked Queen going to the King, the King summoning the Cardinal to give an account of his actions, and de la Motte had skipped. When de Rohan related his story showing the forged letters, the King and Queen were outraged. The King suspected at once that Rohan and others of the faction hostile to his wife had plotted to discredit her. He ordered the Cardinal, Cagliostro, who was thought to have masterminded the whole intrigue, his wife, and de la Motte, who was found and apprehended, all be sent to the Bastille. As months wore by, the King, believing that an open trial was necessary to convince the public of the Queen's innocence, foolishly ordered an investigation by those considered enemies. The Paris Parliament. Strange. Cagliostro, also outraged at the horrible injustice of a system which allowed a king to imprison in the Bastille anyone he chose for as long as he chose, even for a lifetime, without access to a lawyer, to be tortured at the pleasure of his jailers, wrote and prophesied the brutal death of the Bastille's governor, the Marquis de Launay, and predicted that stone by stone the Bastille would be demolished till the people of France could dance on its site. And that sounds vaguely familiar to what we read, during the Middle Ages and the Inquisitions, and even in some cases here in America, the aspect of, of, being imprisoned for as long as the government chooses, and not have access to a lawyer, or to be tortured at the pleasure of his jailers. All of these things sound vaguely familiar. Anyways, let's get back to it. At the trial, which was intended to be the trial of the century for France, and was, Madame de la Motte accused Cagliostro of stealing the necklace and selling the stones, piece by piece. In England, which in reality she had done herself, with the help of her husband. The judgment of the Parliament, after due deliberation, was pronounced May 31st, 1786, finding Madame de la Motte to be the guilty party, condemning her to be publicly whipped naked, branded, and to life in prison. Cagliostro, Serafina, and Rowan were found guiltless and released. But the governor of the Bastille, fearing a daylight demonstration, waited till midnight to let the Cagliostros out. But even then, a tumultuous crowd of almost 10,000 Parisians, or Paris citizens, I'll just simply say, were there to greet him as their hero and benefactor against a king who was unjust, and his innocence as a victim of the hated Austrian Marie Antoinette, whom Parisians believe to have been guiltily involved in the affair of the necklace. So intense was the hatred for the king and queen, brought to a climax by this affair, that later Napoleon said, quote, "The queen's death must be dated from the diamond necklace trial," unquote. After a year in prison, Madame de la Motte conveniently escaped and joined her husband in London, wrote an autobiography, and died in 1791. The king and queen banished Cagliostro from France, declaring him, and recorded by many historians, to have been an impostor and petty crook who lived during the time by the name of Giuseppe Balsamo. Afterwards, we find him wandering from one country to another, but always chasing his cherished dream. It was May 17th, 1789, the year the French Revolution erupted, that the Cagliostros set off by carriage for Rome to obtain from Pius VI approval for his Egyptian rite of Masonry, a move intended to officially unite Catholic, Christian, and Mason, and fulfill his treasured ambition. But it was not to be, for this pope also was preoccupied with the inauguration of another obelisk raised in his honor. Cagliostro was seized by the Inquisition and died in 1795 mysteriously at their hands. The pope's basically, I can't bother with this rubbish because I have another phallic symbol being raised in my honor. I'm gonna keep my thoughts to myself on that one. Oh man, sometimes the Antichrist can be can be very funny to watch. And some of the statements and some of the things he enjoys. and to believe that there are those that consider him the vicar of Christ. I need a phallic symbol raised in my honor. If you could tell me where Jesus had phallic symbols raised in his honor, I would really would like to know. Anyway, economic straits, pressing issue to launch French Revolution. Marvelously, all the components designed to produce the French Revolution did its intended work. With attitudes and opinions successfully molded well in advance, The one component that could always be counted on to effectively touch everyone and result in an abundant supply of choice opinions was economic straits. That is true. All you got to do is just look at all other revolutions and wars. What is usually brought about beforehand? A failing economy. Over and over and over again. So again, I'm going to read that last sentence again. The one component that could always be counted on to effectively touch everyone and result in an abundant supply of choice opinions was economic straits, which became the pressing issue used to get the revolution's wheels in motion. In 1789, the year of the Revolution, the population of France was about 26 million. Of these, about 21 million lived by farming. But although over a quarter of the land in the country was owned by peasants, few possessed more than the 20 acres or so which were necessary to support a family. So the vast majority of Frenchmen were not only forced into poverty conditions, with many being abject, but their grievances were aggravated by their liability for most all the taxes from which the privileged nobility were exempt. However, almost sounds like politicians and stuff like that in the White House today, huh? However, it meant nothing that the humble peasant was poor, miserable, and hungry, but now the king himself was having serious financial problems. As a result of the king's extravagant spending, his indulging of his two extravagant brothers and his beloved queen, whose debts the king always paid, the increasing expense of government and public works, and the cost of the country's wars, in particular, French's participation in the War of American Independence, which involved expenditure of about 2,000 million livres, made the collection of further and more burdensome taxes inevitable unless the state were to slide even deeper into bankruptcy. The mind of the nation now was well programmed and conditioned by the propaganda agents of Rome, bristling for a quote-unquote change as the nation's money problems worsened. But more wonderful, the problem was aggravated during the summer of 1789 by a prolonged drought that rendered millers unable to grind grain due to an acute shortage, and as a consequence, a shortage of bread that brought on an increase in outbreaks of violence. The perfect setting for those plotting a revolution. At the beginning of his reign, Louis XVI had called upon the services of the clever, witty Comte Jean-Frédéric de Maurepas. With the guidance of Maurepas and of Maurepas' intimate friend and confessor, the Abbé Joseph Alphonse de Viry, Louis had gradually and nervously replaced his grandfather's ministers with others, including Anne Robert Turgot, Baron de Launay, whom in 1774 he appointed Controller General of Finances. He also decided, or more accurate, was counseled to recall the parliaments, including the ancient Paris Parliament. This Paris Parliament, quite unlike the British Parliament, was one of 13 appeal courts which had assumed the right of registering laws, principally royal edicts connected with taxation, but which aspired to the right of veto as well. Its jurisdiction covered about 10 million people in northern France, and since its influence was so much greater than the other provincial parliaments which were inclined to follow its lead, it was usually referred to simply as Parliament. Its members, being far from representative of the people as a whole, granted hereditary nobility, and the principal offices had come to be held by some of the most renowned and wealthy dynasties in France. Proposed for the admission of commoners were always strongly resisted. Although Parliament was far more concerned with its own interests than those of the nation at large, it had come to be regarded in the people's mind, largely as a result of its own propaganda, as their champion. It did indeed, its members being aristocrats, do quite as much to promote and publicize liberal political theories as the philosophers, whom both were bent on the eventual destruction of royal absolutism, while in the meantime resisted any encroachment upon their privileges. These privileges were extensive. Only they could become ambassadors. Only they could reach the highest offices in the church. Only they could command regiments in the army. Indeed, since 1781, it had become virtually impossible to obtain a commission in the army at all unless 4 generations of aristocratic birth could be proved. And of course, they were privileged to be exempt from paying most all the burdensome taxes. King Louis XVI was aware of all of this and knew he was asking for trouble when he recalled the exiled Parliament and spoke to the reconvened members on November 12, 1774. Being guided as a pawn in Rome's game of chess, he chose instead to follow the advice of Maurepas and his Roman confessor, who argued that he must listen to public opinion and follow it. That a monarch who recalled Parliament would be considered a friend of the people. I should like to be loved, he had once declared. With the recall of the Parliament and the appointment of fresh ministers, the people began to hope that a new age might be dawning. In reality, it did little to alleviate the plight of a nation whose fundamental grievances remained without a remedy. To demonstrate the involvement and participation and the effectual influence of the priests and prelates of the Roman Catholic Church during the time just prior to the French Revolution eruption, we will briefly follow events and those names that are so famous in leading France into its Great Revolution of 1789. As stated, France had its overwhelming financial problems that were taking the nation to the brink of utter collapse, with the monarchy collapsing with it. Seeking solutions and a remedy, France went through numerous finance ministers with the hope that each could provide a miracle that would save the nation. Turgot, being appointed in 1774, was dismissed 2 years later in May of 1776. Having lost the confidence not only of the king and queen and the court, but of the financiers, the church and parliaments as well. Next, Jacques Necker was appointed, who was considered a financial genius. When he came to study the country's inequitable tax system, Necker was faced with complicated and intractable problems which he was quite incapable of resolving. He was forced to resign. Necker was succeeded as Director General of Finance by Charles Alexander de Calonne, who realized the perilous state the country's finances were in, took the only practical step, but hazardous, drew up a detailed program that would reform the whole tax system. Calonne proposed a new tax on land, which was to be imposed without regard to the status of its owners and which would accordingly fall most heavily upon the privileged classes. The apprehensions of the nobility and the clergy that this new tax would prove not only financially burdensome, but also the first step towards the extinction of their privileged positions, aroused immediate opposition in all the high places. The king's brother, the Comte de Provence, and the king's cousin, the Duc d'Orleans, Freemasonry's Grand Master of the Grand Orient, both voiced their disapproval of him. So did Etienne de Allegre, one of the leading magistrates in the Paris Parliament. So did the adherents of Necker, who chose to believe their hero's assertion that France had been solvent at the time his enforced resignation. So did Lameni de Briand, the sickly, ingratiating, and scarcely less than agnostic Archbishop of Toulouse, who hoped to succeed him. So did the influential Archbishop of Narbonne, who declared, "Cologne wishes to bleed France to death. He is merely asking us whether to make the incision on the feet, the arms, or the jugular vein," unquote. And so did the Queen. Obliged to listen to these voices in condemnation of his minister, the king at first supported him, then wavered, asking constantly for advice. "What can I do? What should be done?" In the end, Cologne was dismissed and exiled to his estates in Lorraine. Once threatened with proceedings against him by the Paris Parliament, he fled to England. Now Archbishop Briand of Toulouse replaced him, but when he presented to the Special Assembly of Notables, a convention nominated by the king, whose 144 members included mayors and magistrates, as well as nobles and prelates, a shadowy version of the proposals made by Cologne, of which he had rejected, the notables were in no mood to accept from the archbishop even so mild a concoction of the medicines that they had refused to take from Cologne. The assembly of notables was dissolved, and they went home, having demonstrated the firm determination of most of their number to prevent the king's ministers tampering with their privileges. The king was desperate to find a source for fresh money, so the land tax and other measures which the notables had rejected were now presented to the Paris Parliament. The Parliament, among whose members were several who had sat with the notables, were equally determined, refused to let them pass, protesting that any new taxation required the assent of the Estates General, a consultative body of clergy, nobles, and representatives of the Commons or Third Estate, which had not met since 1614 in the reign of Louis XIII. Confronted by an uncompromising parliament and worried by a crisis in foreign affairs, the king and Briand decided to use force. They dispatched troops as the king invoked his right to enforce various edicts to which Parliament had objected, depriving the Paris Parliament and all the provincial parliaments of their power of opposing the monarch's will. In that summer of 1788, violence erupted all over France, with no taxes whatever being collected. In protest that they were acting in defense of the parliaments, nobles and magistrates came together to block any attempts the government had to impose equality of taxation. As the prospect of national bankruptcy grew more alarming, Briand turned in desperation to the clergy, but they, in an extraordinary meeting of their own assembly, also condemned the government's reforms and granted only a small proportion of the money for which they had been asked. Forced to accept defeat, Briand announced on July 5th that the States General would be summoned to Versailles in May the following year of 1789. A few weeks later, he handed in his resignation. The king had no alternative but to reappoint Necker and recall the parliaments. The Estates General summoned. Just when there was a general satisfaction being felt by the announcement that the Estates General were to be reconvened, it was soon overcast by a further declaration by the Paris Parliament, that they should be composed as they had been in 1614, which was to say that the three orders whose representatives were to meet in Versailles, the clergy, the nobility, and the third estate or commons, were to have an equal number of delegates. This means that if each order were to vote separately, the clergy and nobility could always combine in defense of their privileges to thwart the aspirations of the third estate. This announcement jolted the third estate, and the popularity of Parliament, which the middle class had formerly been inclined to view as a bulwark against despotic government, collapsed overnight. Thus it was that in the autumn and winter of 1788, the struggles between the monarchy and the aristocracy was transformed instead into a social and political conflict between the privileged and unprivileged classes. Thus also, by moves and counter-moves in Rome's chess game, the pieces were jockeyed into position to escalate the plotted revolution. It was during this interval of time, from the autumn of 1788 through the summer of 1789, that politics became an all-consuming interest. As the issues broadened, the solidarity of the privileged orders weakened. A split appeared even in the ranks of the Parliament of Paris, between the conservative magistrates and those with liberal inclinations. The Third Estates also found champions of its claims among the lay and clerical aristocracy. Also in these months was formed, in opposition to the coalition of the conservative aristocracy, a combination of liberal theorists and politicians who assumed the role of the patriotic or national party. It was during these months that political tracts and pamphlets flooded France and Paris by the hundreds of thousands, supplied each day with numerous new titles. Here comes the propaganda. It became a war between the Third Estate and the other two orders, as a stream of freshly printed pamphlets propounded the ideas of a new Declaration of Rights, new conceptions of national sovereignty, and France's need of a constitution. And nearly all the leaders of the movement were members of a secretive body known as the Society of 30, which acted as an organizing group for liberal measures. The Society of 30, founded in November 1788, usually met at the house of the rich magistrate and parlementaire Adrien Duport. Many of its members were equally rich, able to finance the authorship and distribution of pamphlets, the circulation of lists of grievances which were intended to serve as models for others, and the dispatch of agents to the provinces. Oh boy, here we go with some names. They included Duc de la Rochefoucauld, Lincourt, and the Duc d'Aiguillon, the Marquis de Condorcet, and the Vicomte de Noailles, and among their number were also three men whose influence on the course of events during the next few months was to become quite profound. Whew. Like I said, I apologize for butchering these names. One of these was the Roman Catholic Abbé de Talleyrand Périgord, who became Bishop of Audun in January of 1789, and lived to become known to the world as Prince Talleyrand. Another was the Marquis de Lafayette, who had fought with distinction in America under George Washington. The third was Roman Catholic Abbé Emmanuel Joseph Sieyès, Joseph Seuss. And while the great political debate raged in the cafes, clubs, and salons of Paris, fired up by the liberal sentiments expressed in the patriot pamphlets and tracts bombardment, Joseph Seuss wrote one of his own that ignited a fire in its readers and was to become one of the most famous and powerful pamphlets of the time, with its arresting title that asked the question, "What is the Third Estate?" The pamphlet turned it into three questions that soon half of France was asking. To its questions, it also gave its explosive answers. What is the Third Estate? Everything. What has it been up till now in the political order? Nothing. What does it desire to be? Something. Unquote. That something included the rights to have as many representatives as the other two orders combined, as well as to have its votes counted by head rather than by order. It also included the right to share in the framing of a constitution free from interference by any outside force. Of the 26 million souls in France, Seuss pointed out at least 25 million belonged to the Third Estate, the untitled laity. In effect, the Third Estate was the nation. If, in the Estates General, the other classes should refuse to sit with it, it would be justified in constituting itself the National Assembly. That phrase stuck. It was Finance Minister Necker who, recognizing the great problems the forthcoming convocation of the Estates General posed, set about persuading his fellow ministers and the royal family to issue an edict granting what had become known as double representation to the Third Estate. There were heated discussions at court where both the king and queen, as well as the Comte de Provence, were eventually persuaded to support Necker's view, and on December 27th it was announced that the Third Estate would indeed have double representation. Take notice that each calculated step prepared the way for the next in the progression to attain their ultimate goal, which was to arouse, inflame, and energize the whole populace of France, especially the masses of commoners. For example, France's financial distress, whether real or exaggerated, compelled a need for a competent finance minister. After the services of several, one finally presents a plan that offered an honest solution, but from the very outset knew that his proposal would be like poking a stick in a hornet's nest. So did everyone else. His reward was disgrace and criminal charges. In sheer desperation, the king ramrodded the tax plan through. In just his haughty determination, the aristocracy opposed it, demanding the broader consulting body of the Estates General. This opened wide the floodgates of commoners who, as 96% of the population of France, demanded to be heard as the true voice of the nation. From the plotters' viewpoint, things now were on a roll. We're going to conclude this section of chapter 12, the perpetrators and evolution of the Great French Revolution, and that last paragraph does speak volumes, doesn't it? Because what if you can create a system, or you can create something that everyone will be up in arms with, and that will totally basically persuade the public to support something when in fact it was all perpetrated from the beginning. For example, You got this whole thing with ISIS and building walls and refugees and these types of things. You know, and you got the elections. You got Trump causing a stir. You got the people being aroused. You got Black Lives Matter and all of these subgroups that are just running roughshod, supposedly, everywhere. And all of this really exploded maybe just a couple of months ago when the campaign trails of both Clinton and Trump started to escalate. And so you can see examples of this. You can see examples of the French Revolution even up to the present day. And when you understand who the perpetrators of this French Revolution is, then you can understand who the perpetrators of the current affairs of this world are. And so I will leave you with that. Thank you for listening. Again, I apologize for the butchering of many French names. We got one more video here with this chapter, so this has probably been the worst chapter I've read regarding my pronunciation. But I do the best I can. Okay, I'm not a scholar, so but I do appreciate you taking the time to listening to these book readings, as I do think that when digesting these things, I think they can help, especially when it comes to the historical interpretation of Bible prophecy. So, thank you for listening. Truth be told, truth be known, stay safe. God bless, and we will see you next time. Bye-bye.